Thank you. Can everyone hear me? All right. Thanks for inviting me, and I will do my best to talk about what we have foreseen as addressing identity challenges over the course of the last couple of years at Oracle, and as well as in the industry that we see out there that's looking at the open source world as well. I'll be touching on some of those concepts towards the end of the discussion. So a little bit about my background. I actually have joined Oracle about 2 years ago, and I've been working in identity and access management ever since. The application security space is very interesting, and I'm also a current member of the OWASP chapter in Singapore. So all those part of the OWASP chapter and here, you know, just hi, hello. So back to today's presentation. Essentially, one of the reasons why I started this slide was just to show that, well, obviously Einstein is not here presenting from university and where he is in the institute. But the key thing to note is that it really is myself. I'm Amit Singh Dhillon, Senior Advisor for Identity Management Security. So what uniquely differentiates me from another person, perhaps, that you would have seen in the slide? Well, some things that we have to note, for example, would include your context in how you are actually talking about something pertaining to a conference. Here we are discussing about addressing identity challenges. We also talk about the unique time that this is occurring to identify that that conference is actually occurring today. That's matched with the location, in fact, where we are, and we could have been in another place as well. Some of the other things that are more apparent would be like your visual aids in identifying me in respect to Einstein in this case. Also, there's an identifier that uniquely mentions a name difference, and we all know that can be different as well and difficult to manage. There's also a particular role, as I will touch later in this conference, on how roles could potentially manage organizational changes and perhaps even help us in managing fraud. One of the other key areas is the historical precedence on what a person really was and what he is today, so how the behavior changes. Finally, the last piece, really the entitlements and what a person is and what he's allowed to do. So these are some of the unique characteristics or attributes in whatever way you want to look at it, from the directory standpoint, from the visual standpoint, that uniquely identify a person. The last piece right there, an unfederated, meaning, well, if you had secure exchange of information between different conferences or different institutions, how would you have federation capabilities with that? We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So in summary, this sort of gives you an idea that there's a lot of unique characteristics or attributes that single out a particular individual, and there's a lot more we can do to identify between what is a person and what is another representation of the same person. A lot of people talk about digital personas, and there are a whole lot of different words that you would see in the identity and access management landscape. So we have been seeing that obviously, in today's world, that business is risky, and a lot of losses in terms of people losing money because of fraudsters getting inappropriate access privileges and so forth. But we also have to understand that there's a lot at stake for the processes that needs to be better in place for changing times and so forth. So we need more of a risk-aware approach, and that's going to be the theme of my presentation today, essentially. Citigroup and Mellon Bank were just some of the ones that were victims of such fraudulent use, for example. So what are some of the challenges that are facing enterprises today? We see a whole lot of needs for strong authentication. There are needs for how HR data is entered, and that's different from before you start in the company and after you leave, for example. Falsification of information, as well as insider fraud and so forth. think I was just reading one of the biggest challenges for organizations these days is that people who are leaving for competitors tend to download a lot of information before they're leaving, architecture drawings, diagrams, and so forth, so that, in the event that they go somewhere else, you're going to be impressing the new manager, right? I know all this stuff about what I'm doing and so forth. So a lot of these things are, I wouldn't say common sense, but they are bound to happen. So we need the systems in place to be able to manage a lot of these insider fraud type of activities. And also from the financial angle that we see, there's a lot in terms of account takeover, wire fraud, phone tapping, and so forth. So even to the extent that the other day I was talking to a company in the utility space, there's even things like meter fraud and how meters are looked at on a daily basis. So it's just not ending on one particular space. As long as you have internet access and you're exposing a function for another person to use, and this proliferation of challenges will definitely come. So more recently, we have seen securities, commodities as well. Definitely, there is a need to have more of a proactive approach, a risk-aware approach, rather than a detect and repair and fix type of approach. So we have seen that a lot of legal implications for some of these challenges coming across, but they're not strong enough. We need something that can withstand the changes and be able to better evolve with these changing regulations as well. So just in the context of what's going on in the world, we realize that there's a lot of write-downs and what's occurring with banks. There's a magnitude of impact. There's a lot of losses. So you're going to ask me, what has this got to do with security and HITB? Well, it's a failure of risk management and a governance function to some extent. It's a failure of companies in a point of view to realize that risk is an important function that needs to be dealt with from a security standpoint as well. I would imagine that you could potentially tie a user to a particular transaction and be able to assign a particular reputation in the future and say that this transaction might not be good enough if it amounts to another 100 people doing the same thing. It could potentially cause an economic wreck, for example. So there are potentials, and there is a lot of areas that identity and access management could impact business, so to speak. I'm not saying that we are talking about credit risk or market risk and so forth, but risk per se has not been defined that well in a lot of institutions. And perhaps security could be a better way for a lot of these folks to understand how it could make an impact for them. So now going into more a bit about the identity challenges that we see in today's world. Well, really in the real world, you see more of like a sense-based type of interaction between human beings and so forth. There's proximities and so forth, and there's titles and privileges. So, as an analogy, or, what we see in the digital world is it's more authentication-centric if you look in terms of what a sense-based interaction is. Proximity, we actually look in terms of remote connectivity, whether you're coming in and, dialing in to the internet and access. And relationships, we manage through what we call federation and, the premise of trust and relying parties and so forth. Titles and privileges, well, this is an interesting topic. We will discuss in terms of roles and permissions and, how we can mimic relationships within a particular hierarchy or like a reporting structure and so forth. So there's a key difference between what the real world and digital world, but we're trying to, best represent a lot of these relationships. So the types of threats and consequences are obviously growing, and we realize that there's a lot of phishing, farming, man in the middle, man in the browser type attacks, and so forth, insider fraud and whatnot. So a lot of these have been from compromised credentials that have been on particular laptop, for example, or in transition, or most obvious, a person sitting in the browser as well. Session hijacking, transaction hijacking, and so forth. So we see a lot of intents from people moving from a criminal type intent to more of fame and fortune kind of requirements and so forth for particular people. So it is a hacking conference, so you might be able to relate to some of these objectives. So what do we see in the challenges in fraud management today? We see that today it's still authentication based. We're still looking at it in terms of what is more like a Boolean type. It's 1 or 0. It's either you're in or you're out. So we also see that there have been proliferation of authorization, basic authorization for applications. They handle their basic roles, their policies that restrict a bunch of users or groups and so forth for access. So the problems are that this can be easily compromised. It's not a business aware or reactive to changes in policies. And also there is needs for forensic analysis or intelligence that needs to be done in the back end. For example, I might want to do some mining of data of your authorization capabilities and how it would change in the future and project that. Do things like what if analysis, or what is, for example, your reporting structure 6 months ago. You would start thinking about things that is like more temporal in nature. So how do you use a lot of these capabilities to move forward in the fraud management world? We see the challenges in these paradigms on computer network as well as the social scale. So the end user challenges become that fraud cannot be controlled and the confidence in the channel is affected. There is lack of ease of use, and people typically have a lot of different tokens when having to log in. Is that the solution? I'm not sure it is. I think it is a step towards the right direction, possibly, but there is definitely a need to adopt more of a risk-based approach. And as the presentation goes on, you will understand more about what I'm talking about, this risk-based methodology and so forth. It's not something completely new. A lot of organizations and banks understand it, well, up until now, if you think about what just happened in the world. So, of course, it has to be cost-effective, and it has to have a strong value proposition for certain industries and so forth. So the enterprise challenges, we see a lot of this complex needs for point-to-point integrations between applications and the fact that it's non-compliant. The business becomes unfriendly, and today's time and age, everyone needs to be able to come in and make a transaction quickly, securely, and more importantly, get 360 view of his capabilities, likewise the enterprise of your services, so that they can give you more value-added services. So going back to what we just discussed on some of the challenges, you kind of begin to understand that context is important. The time of a particular event, transaction, authentication, authorization is important. The location of where it's being done, whether it's geolocation, whether it is being done between different areas in a short period of time, your entitlements, what you really represent, what your title is, that has to be able to be manageable as well. That has to relate to if you move to a different application, you might have different entitlements. How do you manage it in a single sort of manageable way? Your historical behavior as well as your unique identifiers are crucial in this. So we'll touch a little bit into each of these areas right now, focusing a little bit more on the fraud aspect over here. So how do you, for example, use your unique identifier, your name, to be able to create and store or virtualize identities? So we know that in the past, we have always looked at what tools are what called like meta tools. It's synchronizing identities, pulling it all in one place so you can help to manage it better. Well, we want to be able to use identities as they are in the landscape, in the mixed environment, in the messy environment it is, so that you can rapidly deploy applications, for example. And this should go for whether or not you are accessing any type of application, but you could be looking up users, whether they are stored in a directory,